Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to our series on what's going on and what has been going on in Europe. Oh, up here. Yeah. As you recall, the theme for this year has been to take events that have occurred in Europe over the last, 10 or 15 years, when perhaps for a week or two, they dominated the news. Then a solution begins to develop, other subjects come up and push that event off the media. And you sometimes have to wonder, I wonder how that ever really turned out. Well, that's been our theme all this semester. And today we're going to be talking about the financial crisis in the Eurozone. You might remember it started in Greece in about 2012, and then there was a lot of turmoil about how that was going to be solved and how it would affect other economies in the Eurozone. So that's our subject for today, and Carla Ruffer is going to introduce our speaker. Carla, of course, is the girl who put this whole program together.
Hello again. It's good to see y'all. I would like to introduce my coworker, actually. Corinne Tomasi is the Academic Programs Coordinator at the Center for European Studies. We actually started within a day of each other. So definitely been there together a while. She is also a PhD student in the Political Science Department, and she focuses on political economy and monetary union. So this is right up her alley, and she didn't really get a choice, but we got her to talk about it today.
Thank you. Okay, well, thank you. That was very generous. They can't get me to stop talking about them. So let me go ahead and screen share. Okay, so today we'll be okay, no worries. Yeah, perfect. No worries. Okay, so today, as was mentioned, we're going to talk about 10 years on from the Euro crisis and really what it took, which is a playoff of the famous words of Mario Draghi when he settled the markets during the peak of the Euro crisis by saying that the European Central Bank would do whatever it takes. So we're going to see, did that actually happen? Did it come to fruition? Or did we set ourselves up for a continuation of the monetary crisis and the Euro crisis today? See, I always do that, and I'm like a big intro, and then I hit enter, and then nothing happens. So outline for the talk today. I just want to situate us quickly. So what is the European Economic and Monetary Union? What is the European Central Bank? What are we talking about? But then we'll talk about the crisis in two parts, because there is a tendency to think of the Euro crisis as one long 4 or 5 year crisis, but really what it is two individual crises that happens back to back, and really one kind of led to each other. So we'll kind of talk about how that's set up. And then we'll talk about new tools, same rules. So new tools have come out of the Euro crisis through the central bank, through the European Union itself. But are these all based on the same rules? Have we set ourselves up for failure yet again? And then we'll talk about, did the EU actually do whatever it takes? Okay. So our first question is, what is the European Economic and Monetary Union? I will make these slides available, so I won't go in depth in this because I want to focus kind of on the latter half of the presentation. But the idea is that a monetary union is based on this economic integration theory that was put forward by an economist named Bella Balassa, and that there are stages that an entity or a group of countries go through to create a single market, an economic union. And what's important for us today is that the European Union walked through these steps, but didn't get all the way through them. They accomplished the single market, but they stopped at a full economic union. And that's going to be one of the issues that we'll see kind of continually crop up today as we go through what the issues were. And then just a brief history. I'm going to condense what is really a 30-year project down to maybe 2 or 3 minutes. So appreciate that this is a very snapshot view of this. But what is important to know is that the European Economic and Monetary Union was a 30-year project. It has been a goal and an aim of the European Union since the 1970s. Some will argue that it was going back to the very original European coal and steel community. However, there were no explicit calls for monetary union at that time. But in the 1970s, there was an idea that to accomplish the goals of this single market, one integrated market. So for instance, the United States has a single market. Goods, people flow between the states without any type of barriers. The European Union wanted to create something very similar among the sovereign states of the members at that time. So they asked someone to put together a report to create that monetary union. And it was called the Warner Report, and it laid out 2 stages. But you may remember, 1970s was a very also interesting decade for economics in the world. You had the collapse of the Bretton Woods system, you had the oil shocks, and so it made it impossible at that time to really implement this move to European Union, or to a European Economic and Monetary Union. And so the Warner Report was shelved, but there was still impetus to move forward. One of the important things about the European Union, whether it's in economics, social policy, migration, nothing ever dies. Ideas stay because bureaucrats stay. And so bureaucrats were always there with an idea that they wanted to move towards monetary union. And so in the 1980s, you do have this push forward to create a European monetary system, which is about a halfway step. They said, well, we can't complete everything, but we're going to do a halfway step. So they created this monetary system. And it's because the other important thing for the EU, you had the Franco-German motor behind it. There was impetus of your 2 largest members to create that economic and monetary union. And so they pushed forward to create at least this monetary system, which began to tie the currencies of the member states together. And then you had the Single European Act in the mid-1980s, which was the revamping of this idea of European integration. It had stagnated over the last decade or 2. There had not been much forward movement. And so they said, we have to complete the single market, this idea that there will be no barriers between the free movement of goods, people, capital, and services. But to create that Single European Act, and to create that single market, something had to change. And that was that monetary policy had to change. Because if you had to go from Florida to Georgia, but you had your Florida currency, and then you had to convert it into currency in Georgia, you wouldn't be able to flow quite as easily. Goods wouldn't be able to flow. You might not take vacations in Savannah anymore. You might be like, well, let me stick to Florida because I already have that currency. I don't have to exchange it. So a single currency was a core component of completing that single market. They wanted to have one currency to reduce what are called transaction costs. And so they asked Delors, the European Commission president at the time, to create an idea of how to create this monetary union. And he went back to the Warner Report. And his report largely mirrors the Warner Report. So as I said, nothing dies because bureaucrats live on. So the Delors Report largely mimics what was put forward in the 1970s. The Maastricht Treaty was very important because it actually legalized, it constitutionalized the process of creating this single currency, and then it established our European Central Bank. So I want to talk about just the core components before we kind of move on. Pre-crisis, I would say that there are 5 core components of what we are thinking of as the European Monetary Union. The first is the euro, so that actual currency. As of November 2021, there was about 28 billion euro banknotes in circulation, amounting to about 1.5 trillion euros. And when that changeover happened, I don't know if any of you remember, because it was 2002 when the cash handed over, and I have talked to people that were in the countries at the time, and this idea of it's the largest changeover of currency in history. Overnight, between December 31st and January 1st, currencies like the franc, the Deutsche Mark, the lira went away, and ATMs were going to distribute out euros. So it's this novel concept. It is one of the greatest achievements of the European Monetary Union, is the single currency. And then you have the Eurozone, which is the boundaries of the countries that actually use the euro. It's currently 19 member states. It'll be 20 in January when Croatia joins. But the important thing about the Eurozone is that there are opt-out and holdouts. So countries like the UK, which then left, but even Denmark, said, you know what? I like my currency. I don't want your currency. So I am not going to sign the Maastricht Treaty unless you let me opt out. And the EU said, okay, sure, sounds good. And so it creates this differentiation. You are already establishing this pattern that some countries are different than others, and how that cohesiveness is not as cohesive as we think. And then you also have holdouts. All member states are obliged to join the EU, including all these new member states that have joined in the last decade, so the big Eastern enlargement. But you have countries like Sweden, who is literally a perfection at holding out and dragging their feet on joining the Eurozone, but also countries like Hungary and the Czech Republic that have been very skeptical, and even though they are required to by EU law, find reasons to not join the euro. And so there are these issues with a Eurozone that is incomplete, that is only working with a fraction of the country. So you have two types of countries. You have Eurozone countries and you have non-Eurozone countries. So you're already creating this divide. At the heart of the Eurozone is the European Central Bank. It is like any central bank, like the Federal Reserve, the Bank of England. It controls the monetary policy, and its mandate is set in treaties. So it has very specific mandates of what it can do. And again, that will be very important when we talk about the euro crisis and where it's going now. They created a list of requirements, what you had to have before you could join the euro. They tried to create it so that no country could join the euro that wasn't fiscally stable, that wasn't financially stable. So they created convergence criteria. So this is all monetary policy. So you have European Economic and Monetary Union. These first four are monetary union. They have one specification for economic union, and it's the Stability and Growth Pact. They have one law that tries to handle the economic side of an economic and monetary union. So you have this drastic imbalance where you have lots of institutions and laws that set up the monetary union, and you have very little that sets up the economic union. And what it is the Stability and Growth Pact, which is the fiscal rule book, and it creates rules and regulations on the percent deficits and debts that you can have. So budget deficits and then overall total debt. Countries run roughshod over this idea. And the problem is they enforce it when they can, small countries, and they let other countries go without any type of penalty, France and Germany. So just to give us kind of a visual idea, this is the Eurozone. The countries in blue are where the euro is currently used. That light blue-gray is countries that are non-Euro EU countries, but besides Denmark, they are all obliged to join the euro. There's kind of that darker blue color. Those are two countries that are actively in the process of trying to join, so Croatia and Bulgaria. And Croatia, as I mentioned, will join in January. And then what's interesting and what kind of makes the euro a very international, what makes the euro crisis an international crisis is because other countries actually use the euro. And so these green dots that you see and the little yellow dots are countries that actually use the euro that are not even EU member states. So a crisis in two parts. So as I said, what we think of as the European economic or the euro crisis is actually two crises. And so you have this first decade of the EU, and there's a general consensus that the move to a single currency was a success. Economists, bureaucrats, politicians, they're patting themselves on the back. They're saying that we did this. We successfully transitioned from national currencies to one single currency. And they thought it was a seamless and smooth rollout of the notes and the coins. GDP growth for the euro area was on par with the US, and inflation rates on average were low. And the ECB was viewed as an example of a modern central bank. So it was considered to be this bastion of contemporary modern central bank, which comes down to independent. The European Central Bank was set up to be completely separate from any political influence. So it does not have to report to member states. It does not have to report to any EU institutions except for once a year to come before the European Parliament and talk about its policies. But besides that, it is wholly separate from the political sphere. It is independent. But the issue came that what economists and politicians were looking at were averages across the euro area. Because what happened was when you actually disaggregated and you started to look at individual member states, you realized that there was no convergence. And the idea was that a single monetary policy of the euro would cause convergence in economic policies. But you didn't see that. And you had a domino effect between the northern and the southern countries. And again, this is going to become a common theme that you see today, that this cleavage between north and south remains today. And so you have this idea that the north saves and the south consumes, that the north runs account surpluses so that they export more than they import, but the south accrues debt. They import more than they export. And that you have that demand increases in the south, causing high inflation compared to the north. And so the south's debt levels become higher and higher and higher. And so the ECB was bounded by its mandate, though, because it is a constitutionalized mandate to only focus on price stability. So they only looked at the euro level. That was their mandate, with little room to address individual situations. And the idea was that you have this remark from Mervyn King, who was the governor of the Bank of England at the time, that the job of a central bank is to be boring. Monetary policy should be boring. Well, it's not boring. You have the global financial crisis that begins in 2007 and 2008. And this is the first part of the crisis, because while it is a US-born crisis, Europe and other areas of the country, but because of our Center for European Studies, we're going to talk about Europe, it had a huge impact on Europe. And so the idea was that it was the first major test of the Maastricht institutions and of the euro area. Is the European Central Bank ready to take on a crisis? So the background of this is that there were favorable economic conditions. Over the last 20 odd years, this great moderation, you had favorable economic conditions, and you had excessive risk taking. There was the idea that because when countries joined the euro, they got favorable interest rates. They thought they were being able to trade more freely. So they were not considering budget deficits. They were spending, and they were thinking that this would last, that the good times would last. And so they were racking up excessive risk. And so it increased borrowing levels. And then there was this lack of regulation. And this is also what you see in the United States as well. So the housing market, there was an idea that construction was where you wanted to invest in real estate. Prices in houses increased until the bubble popped and house prices fell. And so your investments, your loans are worth very little. So what began in the United States quickly spreads to Europe. And banks in Europe were largely invested in these mortgage-backed security products. So these mortgage loans that all the banks were taking on that we think about when we think about the global financial here, about these zombie loans, these bad loans that were made to households to purchase or construct houses to purchase second homes. Europe banks invested heavily in those loans. So when that market crashed, the banks in Europe were highly at risk from that crash. And so you had this causal chain. The interbank lending dries up. So because they have no money, banks don't have money to lend each other, that dries up. That channel between banks to funnel money to allow loans to go out and to increase economic output dries up. Household wealth decreases, demand decreases, production plummets, and you have high levels of unemployment. So you have this causal chain that as one domino falls, the next domino falls. And so the EU is forced to react in some way. What they thought was the US. In 2007, they're sitting back and they're saying, we did good, guys. This is a US issue. It's not going to impact us. Come 2008, the tide changes, and it's very clear that it is going to be very much a European issue. And so the EU does react in small steps. So you have the European Economic and Recovery Plan, which was allow member states to break the Stability and Growth Pact. So you can see that when needs be, they get rid of the Stability Growth Pact. So what is supposed to be holding up the financial union of all this, the fiscal union of all of this, gets broken all the time. There's measures to encourage to encourage the fight against climate change, because there's the idea that green investment is a new area to invest and improve growth. The ECB is invited to drop its interest rates on their loans, lowering taxation. There's this idea that there can be national responses to national problems. So the ECB does lower its key interest rates, so interest rates that it charges banks, and things like that. They lower those. Member states do increase their deposit insurance. They're trying to protect depositors, so citizens. And they take some measures, but these are mostly national responses to national issues, or what are considered national issues. But you're asking governments to spend. So government debt between 2016, so you have the beginning at 2006, and you see that government debt levels continue to increase. And so you have Greece as one of your top debt increasers, and you'll also see that part of this spike is when they said, oops, we've actually been fudging our numbers for the last decade or so. But it's not just Greece. I mean, there's a lot of pressure put on Greece as the profligate state that caused all this. But there are other countries, and Italy will continue to be a thorn in the European Union side as we go. But you'll see that all of this led to excessive government debt. And so then you come to the second part of the crisis, which is the sovereign debt crisis. And so this begins in about 2009. And so you see that there's 2008 happens with the global financial crisis. They think that they've resolved it. They think that they've put a cork in the hole that is sinking the European economic environment, but they don't. They are just adding more water into it and hoping that things stay afloat. And so there's this idea that there was wasted good times. So we kind of get back to this idea that in this move into to create the euro and to join the euro, member states had to get their fiscal and their financial policies into line. And many states benefited from the euro. It was a stronger currency than what they had. But instead of saving, not running budget deficits, they ran budget deficits. They accrued their debt. So they wasted this good time, and it created soaring public debt, and it leads to instability. And so you have the first domino that falls, and that's Greece. So Greece Prime Minister in 2009 has to adjust his projected budget deficit from 6 to 12%. So he doubles the anticipation of the budget deficit, and it comes out that actually Greek governments for the last decade or so have been fudging the numbers that they've been sending to the European Union. And so markets lose all confidence. And so the repercussions of that decision was a loss. The rating agencies tanked Greece's rating. So rating agencies have, and there's lots of discussion about whether or not this is fair, but rating agencies grade sovereign debt. So when sovereigns try to sell out their bonds, like treasury bonds, to increase growth, rating agencies put a grade on it. AAA is your best status. The United States has AAA status. Most European countries had AAA status. But with one credit rating agency dropping the Greek debt, all the rating agencies joined in, and everybody dropped the rating of the Greek sovereign debt. And so it led to no trust and the financial, no trust in Greek government debt. And so they lose access to financial markets. And this leads to the need to form a troika. And so some of you may have heard this new word in the news. It's the idea that to receive money to help get them out of their issues, there needs to be, very paternalistically, a group of outside experts that manage their accounts for them, that have an eye over the shoulder of Greek bureaucrats as they're creating budgets, as they're deciding about spending levels and things like that. So the troika is formed of the European Commission, the European Central Bank, and the IMF. But what happens is there's not just a loss of confidence in Greece, there's a loss in confidence in the euro area. And markets begin to believe that all euro area countries may fail, with the exception of Germany, for the most part. But even France gets downgraded. Its credit ratings get downgraded. So there's a lack of confidence in the whole euro area, and this creates a domino effect. And so you have Ireland that falls because they had to spend so much money in propping up their banks that were overexposed to the United States. They fall in 2010. They have to request a bailout. Portugal had macroeconomic imbalances, so they had high levels of unemployment, low productivity and growth. They fall in spring 2011, and they have to request a bailout. Spain, overexposed to US banks, if you see a theme. Housing bubble. They fall in spring 2012. And then Cyprus, very exposed to Greek debt. And so when in 2012, about 3 years after Greece, after you have, there's a call on Greek debt, people that own Greek debt, to take a cut. They say, you're not going to get all your money back. But Cypriot banks are heavily invested in Greek debt. And so they take a hit and they have to request a bailout. And so you have this continuing falling. And I'm happy to answer questions about specific ones of these during Q&A, but again, I want to get us through here, so I'm going to kind of move us along. And this idea of, again, I can spin the slides, but what you should see is the cycle. So the idea is that this doom loop continues, that what the euro crisis established was a doom loop. So that you have bank crisis, you have issues with growth and competitiveness, which requires governments to spend money, which creates sovereign debt crises, which make their bonds trash, and banks are heavily invested in sovereign bonds, which starts the loop all over again. So you create this, what is, unfortunately for banks and EU sovereigns, a doom loop. So the idea is that you have all of this going on. So of course, the EU must have learned something. They must have been like, we probably should finally work on that economic union and not just focus on our monetary union. I'm not going to go over this, but for some of you that weren't here for Asla Baysal's talk, she talked about failing forward. And failing forward was a theory that came out of the euro crisis. So Eric Jones and et al. Were looking at the euro crisis and figuring out why the EU is only creating haphazard responses to the euro crisis. And it was in among these half-baked institutions, you were having institutional failures leading to more crises and leading to these lowest common denominators. So the euro crisis is where failing forward comes from, even though I will say that that is a really good academic example of somebody putting a name to something that people talked about all the time. And they just get credit for calling it a pithy name like failing forward, but neither here nor there. So you have this idea of whatever it takes. So you're past the peak of the crisis. So wither the euro, what's going to happen to the euro? There's a lot of talk at this time of, is the euro going to collapse? Is this idea of a common currency a failure? And so what of the ECB? What can the ECB do? Its hands are tied. Its mandates. It's constitutionalized. It can't do anything. But the sovereign crisis brought to the fore the institutional design problems in the euro. And so that's what I'm talking about, these constitutional bindings. The European Central Bank is bounded not only by its mandate, but by specific requirements within the treaties that they cannot finance monetary debt of member states, and they cannot bail out a member state. So the European Central Bank wants the euro to survive, but they're trying to figure out what they can do to get around its requirements of no monetary financing and no bailouts. And so the idea is that where there's a will, there's a way. And that is an underpinning of most crises in Europe, is that there's usually a political will to make this survive. There's too much built in to economic and monetary union. The single market, the monetary union, is held up as some of the greatest successes of the European Union. There's not a lot of political will to let it fall. So the European Central Bank, because there's no corresponding financial institutions at the EU level, the European Central Bank really steps up. And they create this series of 5 programs over the course of about 5 years that are meant to prop up failing governments, to help with the fact that they don't have access to financial markets. So they get around this idea of no bailouts and no monetary financing by not purchasing debts directly from member states. They purchase them on what are called the secondary markets. That means that somebody else has bought that bond And the European Central Bank goes to that secondary, that intermediary, and buys it from them instead. And so they create these programs that increasingly allow the European Central Bank to help recapitalize both banks, national banks, but also to help and prop up governments as well. And so you continue and you have kind of these initial small steps, and then you have whatever it takes. And so in 2012, the markets are tanking the euro. They have no faith in it. And so Mario Draghi at this random UK conference gives a speech, and about 7 minutes into an 11-minute speech says the European Central Bank will do whatever it takes, and it will be enough. And it's this incredible example, one, of how much words can matter, because those words alone stop markets from crashing. Overnight, you see a stabilization. It's not an instant rise, but it stabilizes. And so he creates from this the outright monetary transactions, which is a whole new step. It's a incredibly huge step forward in creating a lender of last resort function, which means the buck stops here. The European Central Bank takes on the idea that it is their job that if a member state needs help, they are the lender of last resort. And so it's a huge step forward. They also create an idea of forward guidance. They're going to start creating policy releases for markets to tell them where they think the economy is going and what they think their policies are going to be. So they actually begin to engage with markets directly and tell them what they're talking about, things that national central banks have been doing for many years now, things like the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England have been doing for many years. The European Central Bank says, we've got to do it. We can no longer trust national governments to mollify markets. We have to step in. If I have time, I love this.
There's another message that I want to tell you today is that within our mandate, the ECB is ready to do.
Yeah. Should I try now?
Whatever it takes. There's another message that I want to tell you today is that within our mandate, the ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro. And believe me, it will be enough.
I love that quote. I just listen to it sometimes because it makes me happy. But so with 18 seconds of commentary,
another message.
Mario Draghi calms the markets. And so there's this idea that the European Central Bank alone can no longer support economic and monetary union. So over the course of the years following the euro crisis, the European Central Bank itself starts to say, guys, we cannot do it alone. You have to complete the monetary union. And there is political will to move forward. And so you create these fiscal responses. And so what you see over the last 10 years is a moving towards fiscal responses. So trying to complete that incomplete economic and monetary union. And it begins with a six-pack reforms of fiscal rules meant to enhance the Stability and Growth Pact. It then continues with the creation of EU-wide banking stress tests, the idea that a national bank is no longer a national bank when you have a single market. What happens in a Dutch bank affects Cypriot banks. What happens in Spanish banks affect Estonian banks. So you have to recognize that, and we have to be doing EU-wide national stress tests. It can't be relied on just at the national level. You also create a fiscal compact. So this is an agreement in 2011 for economic policy convergence, that they are actually going to try to, that you can't just expect convergence to happen, you have to make the policies. And so there is movement forward to make fiscal policy convergence happen through things like balanced budget requirements and benchmark for debt reductions. The one problem here is it creates differentiated integration. You already have differences between Eurozone and non-Eurozone members, yet with the fiscal compact, you still have some members signing on to this and others opting out. So are you creating an unsustainable policy by allowing some member states to opt out? You're creating two speeds of Europe. That was big in the 2012s, 2013s, two speeds Europe. But you're creating differentiated integration. How is that going to impact you when you come later on? And then they actually set up a European stability mechanism, which is a safety net for sovereigns in severe financial distress. So they create a Eurozone-wide funding mechanism to help out member states. So there is this recognition that you can't expect convergence to happen anymore. You have to take an active step. And so the biggest step that's taken is European Banking Union, is what plays a big role today right now when you have calls that is there going to be another sovereign debt crisis in 2022. And so European Banking Union was a decision that you had to sever the link between banks and sovereigns. You needed to enhance resiliency. And again, it's no longer a national issue, it's a supranational issue. And so they wanted to create a single rule book for all of the Eurozone and for financial actors within the Eurozone to create prudential requirements, improve protections for depositors, and to manage failing banks. And so they had a three-pronged approach, and this created a single supervisory mechanism, which set up the European Central Bank to be the supervisor for 110 of the largest banks in the Eurozone, representing about 82% of assets in the Eurozone. So the European Central Bank becomes the supervisor for any large bank in the Euro, regardless of your nationality. It's the European Central Bank that you report to, that can have site visits, that can lift your capital requirements, can tell you that you're failing and require steps to be made to change. And that's a huge thing. Banks are very national concepts, traditionally. You have the single resolution mechanism, which is an idea that if a bank is failing, we can't just rely on a national government to wind down that bank. It needs to be done at a supranational level. And then there is a very beautiful idea to create a European deposit insurance scheme, so to have an EU-wide guarantee for deposits. And this is where you see that the EU has great lofty ideas, but you have issues of some things being completed, but other things being left incompleted. So you have institution guarantees, but you don't have a lot of guarantees at the citizen level. And so you actually are beginning to have issues with citizens not trusting their own financial issues, because Cyprus is like, we had to take a cut. Citizens' bank accounts took cuts to help bail out Cyprus. And so there's this idea that you're looking out for the institution political level, but what are you doing to look out at the local level? And this is going to come to issues like populism, which I'll talk about in my last slide, and to set up a talk that's going to happen in 2 weeks. Populism arises out of this. So you have these issues where they're putting out fires, but they're not always looking at the whole. So they're doing their best. And to be honest, I'm not sure what more, if there's other things they could be doing, because you have to put out the fire that's in front of you, but it is constantly opening up a new rift here in another area. And so this comes to the idea of, did the EU do whatever it takes? And I love the idea. I think it ended up actually being Photoshop, but the idea was that somebody in Italy actually graffitied a wall with, "You are as beautiful as Mario Draghi's whatever it takes." So I love that idea, but I think it turned out that that was Photoshopped, and some Italian did not just decide to graffiti a wall in Italy somewhere. So the idea is, does the status quo remain? And the answer, to some degree, is it's not that easy to say one way or the other. You have these 4 presidents' reports and the 5 president report in 2012, 2015, which is an agreement among all presidents of the major EU institutions that something has to be done, that we have to complete the European Economic and Monetary Union, because until that is done, you will always face a crisis. There is always the potential for an issue in one member state to spread out and cause an issue for the whole Eurozone. And so they wanted to move towards integrated financial markets, which included things like supervision, deposit insurance schemes, and the resolution scheme, which they did do. Integrated budget framework, so pooling decisions on budgets, issuance of common debt, and Euro area fiscal body. So this is the closest you get them to say an EU treasury. They're not very big about the idea of a treasury, but they will talk about a fiscal body. To integrate economic policies, to create policies and guidance at the EU level for things like economic growth, approaching unemployment, social cohesion, and things like that. And there is a recognition of democratic legitimacy. This can't all be done by the European Central Bank, because central banks are usually considered separate from the polity. You remove them from politics, so it feels like you remove them from accountability and transparency. So you have to consider democratic legitimacy. But many people decide that the legal and institutional measures adopted in response to the euro crisis have not fundamentally tackled the asymmetry. That you are making steps, and steps are what you need, but you haven't actually created a symmetrical monetary and economic union. And so it's not an easy yes, no. Yes, they're working on it, but have they completed it? No. And what issues does that create? And so you have the COVID-19. You have COVID-19 that kind of creates some level of a test to see if some of these new financial measures will actually help with the issues that you are seeing. And so global economics took a hit at the beginning of COVID-19 crisis, as we all know. The euro area sovereign debt surpassed peaks of 95% of GDP. And so it passed government debt at the beginning of COVID-19, past government debt levels that you were seeing at the euro crisis. So there was a lot of concern about a recession happening again. You had Greece and Portugal hit around 130% of debt to GDP ratio, which is a 25% increase in 1 year. But you see something different. First, you see solidarity. And the idea that for better or for worse, the narrative changed. In the euro crisis, there could be a morality narrative of profligate South and saving North. And this is a South issue. It's the Mediterranean countries' fault. They spent too much. They cooked their books. They're reaping what they sow. Is it fair? You can ask me that question during questions, but it was the narrative. But COVID-19 hit across the board. There was no country spared from COVID-19. It may have started in Italy. It may have gotten bad in Spain, but it was bad in Germany. It was bad in Denmark. It was bad in northern countries, eastern, western, southern countries. It didn't matter. So there is a pragmatic idea to the solidarity. It's solidarity because it hit everybody the same, but there is solidarity. So take it the way you get it, I guess. And the ECB stepped in early. They said, we're not going to see how this plays out. We're not going to see if the national governments take steps. We're going to step in first. And so they create the Pandemic Emergency Purchase Program, which is another asset buying program. And they were trying to stave off increases in sovereign spread. So the interest rates that are placed on bonds, and the higher the interest rate, the higher the risk on that interest rate. Or the higher the risk on that bond, excuse me. So they were trying to stave off that. But then you also see comprehensive approaches from member states. You actually see fiscal and financial comprehensive approaches. So the first comes in SURE, which is the support to mitigate unemployment risks in an emergency, which is unemployment. So this is the first. So I know that there was questions early on about the concept of Eurobonds, because that's like anathema in the EU, like no Eurobonds. But again, you just rename something because bureaucrats are amazing and they say Eurobonds, no one's going to buy. But if I call it the support to mitigate unemployment risks in emergencies, the EU to fund money that they give to member states to help curb unemployment, to either increase unemployment rates or to provide money to industry to keep people employed, they sell EU debt. And so they sell bonds on the market. They just don't call them Eurobonds. They call them SURE. So that's the first step. Then there's the pandemic crisis support. So the European Stability Mechanism agrees to step in for countries impacted by COVID to provide them with financial funding. And then the biggest piece is Next Gen EU, which is an unprecedented 800 billion euro temporary recovery instrument to help repair immediate economic and social damage brought about by the coronavirus pandemic. I'm like using their exact phrasing on that one. So, but what it comes down to is they agreed to provide both loans and grants. So the idea was that there would be money given that does not have to be paid back. These aren't all loans. But that this couldn't come from the budget. It had to come from some other function, and that function was EU debt being sold on the markets. So the EU has been, if not pooling national debt, pooling EU level debt and selling that to finance the next gen economic recovery. And so you see the beginning of steps, of true steps that a sovereign state like the United States would take to sell treasury bonds. You see that happening at the EU level. But ECB asset purchases and sovereign spread. So this is, I might have had my, yeah. So you see that this is what the EU was trying to do. They were trying to mitigate the spreads that you were seeing in the average 10-year sovereign interest rate. And so you kind of bring it to today, and this is kind of where I'll wrap up, is there's calls recently, if you're reading in the New York Times, Reuters, there's been discussion over the last month or so, is the EU moving towards a new European financial crisis? And again, it's not a simple and straightforward answer. The ECB follows, so you've seen the rise of inflation, and central banks like the Fed, the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan stepped in early and began to raise their interest rates because the low interest rates were causing high inflation. You had 0% interest rates in many of these major economies. They decided to start raising them to bring down inflation. So the ECB finally in June decides to follow central banks and increase its interest rates. And in addition, the ECB agrees to hold off on new asset purchases because when you're flooding the market with money, you are also causing inflation. So however, asset purchases and low interest rates are helping struggling economies with recovery. You still have economies that are having to come back from COVID. And you are having countries that are impacted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So the war in Ukraine, the lingering ramifications of COVID-19, many countries need these low interest rates. They need these asset purchase programs to help them. So you're creating an imbalance. Who do you help? Do you help the larger EU economy by raising interest rates so that you lower inflation across the board? Or do you take into consideration things like Greece and Portugal and Italy are relying on these asset purchases? And the problem is you're in the euro area, so they only have financial. They don't have control of monetary policy. They cannot use monetary policy to devalue their currency during these turbulences. So you go back to this idea of who do you support? Do you look at the EU level or do you help individual countries? And so this time around, there is more of an idea of a balancing act. So yes, there is this, too tough on fighting inflation. You risk market panic because you see sovereign bond rates for Italy skyrocketing. You see sovereign debt in Italy skyrocketing. Because if you think Greece was an issue, Italy is the third largest economy in the EU. If Italy goes, that's going to be one of the largest impacts and largest tests for the EU and the Eurozone. But the ECB recognizes this. And so they create this transmission protection instrument, which is asset purchasing, but it's asset purchasing for very specific countries. And so the joke in the EU is that TPI, so transmission protection instrument, actually stands for to protect Italy. So the idea is that there has to be a balance, that you can't, it's not about choosing one or the other. It's about finding policies that can at least try to address both. And then what's different this time is you have precedent, you have the banking union, and you have next gen EU. And so these are kind of precedences that have been begun and allowed for it to be different. So sovereign bond yields. I will save the concluding remarks to see if there's questions. I can address some of these. I'm happy to do that, but I would like to leave some time, what little there is, for questions.
Okay, thank you.
Questions? Let me come around. It's a lot to absorb, but this is really good. We'll start with Will.
Thank you for your talk. Some time ago, a few years ago, there was talk about banks, in order to gain stability, charging customers negative interest. Could you address that?
Yeah, so at the individual bank level, I'm not as familiar, but yes, there is this discussion of whether or not central banks should charge negative interest rates or 0% interest rates. It really depends your country and their beliefs and their economic ideas. The EU did have negative interest rates I should say the European Central Bank had negative interest rates for a time. For the most part, I believe over the last 3 or 4 years, they've been sticking at zero. There was an idea that negative interest rates are for crisis. It's not something that you continue and after the crisis has passed. At the individual bank level to individual bank account holders, I'm not as familiar with kind of the micro level negative interest rate. So I don't want to lead you astray outside of most banks follow what the central bank is telling them. So their interest rates are largely pulled from what the central bank is doing. And so central banks have largely been moving away from the concept of negative interest rates. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Very interesting. Good history lesson. Back to the slide where the members of the EU were in dark blue. I don't need that slide, but I'm just referring to it.
Yeah.
I noticed right in the middle of all the dark blue was Switzerland.
Mm-hmm.
What are the issues with Switzerland that allows it to survive over there right in the middle of all this integration and economic considerations, tariffs? I don't even know, is Switzerland part of NATO?
No, Switzerland is a historically neutral.
Another example of how they isolate themselves. How do they exist with all this stuff happening all around them?
A strong banking system would be my bet. Switzerland is where you go if you are very wealthy and you want to pay very little taxes. It's very small. So it can exist because of the nature of its economy. It's very small. It's very wealthy. It doesn't need the EU's market, but it has created, it has preferential treatment with the EU. So it's not an EU member state. It has no desire to become an EU member state. They actually almost tanked their free trade agreement. So they do have preferential agreements with the EU, and they almost tanked those because they were almost willing to walk away from it and being like, well, I don't know if we need this. I am not enough of a Swiss politics expert, but I know it's their banking system. They want to ring fence a very important sector. They don't want to bring it under EU regulation. I mean, to be fair, Ireland is also historically neutral and is not at NATO. So I think there are countries that have prioritized a level of neutrality so that they don't join, things like NATO. Switzerland in the UN. There's one European country that's not in the UN as part of their neutrality. Like even the UN is too non-neutral for them, which is pretty surprising. So I don't know if that answers the question outside of because they can. They're one of the few countries that, and Norway is the same, because they have strong economies, high per capita GDPs. They don't need the EU the way that the Eastern European countries needed the EU when the USSR collapsed.
Okay, and in chat, a question says, do the troubled southern countries have poorly enforced income tax laws?
I feel like there would be a difference of opinions by what country answers that. So Greece's income tax laws are not very well enforced. It's just kind of a known factor. Italy's aren't particularly that good either that I know of. I don't think you can say Southern across the board. Greece is a very particular situation that is almost a way it kind of not paying your taxes is a cultural norm in Greece to a certain degree. That's making a huge oversimplification of a very complex situation and environment, but there is this like embeddedness of like it's just what Greeks do. They don't pay their income taxes. So it was really hard when Troika came in and said, no, you have to collect income taxes. Italy, I'm not as familiar with, but the rest of the Mediterranean countries don't have the same problems. And so that's one of the big issues that came, I think, when I was talking about the concluding remarks, is this cleavage that has been created between this idea of what the South is and what the North is. And that these stereotypes to begin with weren't great. I mean, you had the awful acronym of PIGS for the countries that fell during the Euro crisis, Ireland is not a southern country. It's about as north as you can get in the EU. So you just
Close. Hold it close.
Oh, sorry. So you just have this idea that these cleavages were created that created oversimplifications of a system that is very complex. So yes, there was some lasting income tax avoidance in Greece, but would I say it's across the South? No.
Well, coming back to the European the Union Central Bank, you said they have been selling bonds that look awfully close to Euro bonds. Who's buying them?
Well, it's not the European Central Bank per se. It's the Commission's actually selling. So SURE and NextGen EU are run through the Commission, which is where it should be run to a certain degree. If you want it to kind of be your fiscal stabilizer. In all honesty, I don't know exactly. It's sold on the markets. I would have to look into see like which investors are finding those bonds particularly strong, but they are generally considered a safe asset. So they're backed by the budgets of the member states. So they would be highly rated. So I would imagine it wouldn't be a particular investor. It would be pretty broad, but outside of on the markets, I would have to look at the data to see who is buying.
I'm just thinking like in the US, Treasury bonds are held in bank portfolios in the country. I mean, in the banks of the country. So I'm wondering if the National Bank of France or the National Bank of Greece decided they wanted to invest and hold a safe asset, they might be buying Eurobonds, right? Think they could be.
Oh, I wouldn't be surprised if there are, I mean, not necessarily the central banks of those countries, but banks within those countries.
Like the national banks.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, that I would not be surprised to see that, no, because safe assets are usually less risky investment. And many European countries and banks, I should say in particular, have begun to learn their lesson about taking on risk loans.
High risk debt.
Yeah.
One last question. I remember.
We do have one on Zoom too.
Oh, okay. But let's just, you didn't say much about Germany. And I know that during the Greek crisis, that people seem to be looking to Germany to step in and help. Now, how did they mechanize that? Through the Central Bank of Europe, or did they go do it directly?
So, like, what was Germany's impact?
Yeah. How did Germany play in this?
So, in the central bank level, which I can go, it's very interesting. So, the central bank is modeled after the Bundesbank, which is the German central bank, and the price stability mandate is a German requirement. And there's a lot of discussion of to get the single currency. It was a trade-off. France wanted the single currency because the Deutsche Mark was too powerful. And in exchange, Germany got to just add in Eastern Germany after the fall of the wall without fuss or muss. So the central bank is typically what's considered a model of the Bundesbank, the German monetary policy style. However, the Bundesbank and Jens Weidmann at the time, who was their central bank governor, was one of the most vocal critics of the asset purchase program. So you have this slippage in Germany at the monetary policy. Now, bailouts, troika, absolutely. Very little got done without Merkel agreeing and signing off because you needed Germany's backing. And to this day, there are Greeks hate Germany, but I'm pretty sure they may hate Angela Merkel more as like an individual person. But Schultz doesn't have that same power that Merkel did. So I think it will be interesting to see where it goes because Schultz is not Merkel. And Germany has the largest economy, has a strong economy, but it also had Merkel. And so she kind of was the strength there. But at the central bank level, I'd say you actually saw some slippage of the preference because you did have the Bundesbank vocally going out. So it's generally considered a consensus body. Decisions are made. Central bank governors don't go out afterwards and say that they were angry with the policy. Jens Weidmann and Bundesbank, I should say, kind of broke with that and would come out of governing council meetings and be like, yeah, I don't, this is bunk.
These guys are all crazy.
Yeah.
Okay, Rick, go ahead.
Thanks very much. Could you talk about the responses to COVID, the programs, and whether they have increased oversight and whether there were examples of corruption or fraud in the use of these resources?
Yeah, so at the Next Gen EU level, that was actually a really interesting play out between the European Parliament and the rest. The European Parliament wanted conditionality clauses put into Next Gen EU, and they were successful. So you actually see, so every country that wanted to get money from Next Gen EU had to create a recovery and resilience plan, and they had to submit it to the Commission for approval. And the Commission has withheld its approval of Poland for a long time, not because the plan was bad, but because the conditionality clause of the respect for rule of law. And so you had the issues with the judges in Poland. You have issues, I mean, just judges is just the biggest issue that has come up, but rule of law issues, respect for human rights, LGBTQ issues. And so the Commission has been able to use that Next Gen EU as a rule of law mechanism to try to pull countries like Poland and Hungary back in line. Once the funds are dispersed, I'm actually not as familiar with that, so it's a really good question. I know that there is checkups, but if, for instance, Italy, who is one of the largest recipients of Next Gen EU funding, somehow stopped following the plan they put forward and were using funds for other things, there is a mechanism. It's the EU, and so it would be a slow mechanism to pull that money back. So I'm not actually, it's a good question. I'm not as familiar with the regulations once your plan has been provided or approved. It's their biggest regulation and oversight comes when you are trying to get your plan approved. That's when the Commission has the most oversight to tell you your plan works or doesn't work, and to use that conditionality clause if they don't like the politics that they see. That's a very trivialization of the conditionality clause, but I would say that that's probably the highest level of oversight.
Other questions? Just a clarification. Countries that do not use the euro, you mentioned Denmark, and Sweden, are they still on the kroner?
Yes. Yeah, so Sweden and Denmark, if you're making holiday plans, have different currencies, tend to be a little bit higher. So yeah, so Denmark has an opt-out. Denmark has no obligation to join it unless they want to. Sweden is obliged, but since 1995, when countries began to work in the convergence criteria, Sweden has been dragging its feet. There's not too many logical reasons why Sweden shouldn't. It's national currencies are very national concepts. And there's a whole literature about, can the euro create a European identity, because it's a tangible thing you have in your hand every day. So some of it's politics, some of it's economics. Sweden's just dragging its feet. Hungary and Poland are the same. Czech Republic, they just don't want to join. Denmark's the only one that's allowed to just never join because they were going to hold up Maastricht.
Yeah. And other countries that are not that are in the EU that aren't on the euro today, are there others?
Yeah, so the big ones are so Sweden, Hungary, Poland, Czech Republic. I'm trying to count from 20 to 27. Germany has stopped out Sweden. Bulgaria is trying to join. Romania is holding out, but Romania is probably truly economics. It's tough. The convergence criteria are very rigorous criteria. So for some countries, it is truly having to meet the economic requirements. Some countries, it's nationalistic, it's political. I'd say probably Romania is probably more towards the economic side, but Bulgaria is trying and Croatia will join soon.
Right, but I'm not really thinking about joining the EU itself, but EU members
Yes.
who are not using
Yes.
the euro.
So those are all EU members that aren't using.
That's okay.
Yeah.
Good. So they do have quite a differentiation between the people who do use the euro, and it just seems to me it's rather surprising. I understand the nationalism part of the issue, but if you've traveled in Europe, just the idea that you can see a price in euros in France and in Germany and Italy, it's really helpful. I'm surprised.
Yeah. Well, then you have countries like, I want to say, I have to remember the map. It's Bosnia and Herzegovina and I want to say Montenegro that use the euro but have no official agreement with the ECB to do. So there are some people that are just using the euro because it's just easier. They're like, exactly for that reason. Like, it's just easier. We want to join the EU. So maybe this will help us on our path. And then you have the holdouts that are just doing it because for many different reasons. I mean, there's economic and political reasons.
It's just easier. Yeah. Yeah. Any other questions? Will?
A few years ago, there was some concern with regard to countries not paying the appropriate amount of monies they owed to NATO. And you can see where they have issues in their budgets. Would you comment on any areas of cooperation or friction you see between European Union finance-wise and NATO?
It's a really good question. I feel somewhat ill-equipped to answer it. I don't know much about budget. I mean, yes, traditionally, defense spending have been smaller portions of budgets in European states. I believe the NATO is a 2% of the budget has to be defense. So things like the Euro crisis, COVID, and then the actual, invasion of Russia into Ukraine haven't helped things. Well, actually, I would take the last one back. That has helped things, but in terms of seeing the need. But no, the financial crises have not helped the cause, because if they're trying to figure out how to create macro, like automatic stabilizers, things like unemployment, that's where they want to funnel their money to traditionally, rather than defense spending. So it has created friction. And I'm sure that there's writing about it. I'm not as familiar with it. I would just say that what I have just talked about does not help it at all, because then you have to decide, do you put more money towards defense to meet your NATO requirements? Or do you funnel some of that money to bail out banks, to, deposit insurance schemes, unemployment, things, social cohesion type spending?
I think an interesting subject maybe for the future would be to look at the relationship between NATO and the EU, because they coexist, but they're separate. Yeah. And the funding for NATO doesn't flow through the EU, it flows in from the individual countries. That'd be fun to talk about that sometime.
It would be, especially in budgets, because I know that many countries have increased their allocations to defense in response to Russian aggression. Whether that's a temporary increase or you'll see this as a long-term trend, that I am probably ill-equipped to answer.
Any other questions? Well, Corinne, thank you so much. Great job. We've really enjoyed it. Thank you. And next week. Now, there's next week's program, I've had kind of a particular circle around, and that's the follow-up on Brexit. 3 years in, what's really going on? How has it affected the UK? How has it affected Europe? That'll be fun. See you next week.